Birth certificates, as we might understand them today, have been around for a relatively short time. In the USA, you did not establish the practice of birth registrations as a de facto process until the US Bureau of Census was established in the early 1900s. In Canada, the provinces have control over primary registration systems such as birth registrations and other vital statistics, as well as mandatory personal naming systems. Now, intitulated with the moniker birth certificate, this document is highly suggestive of an artifact of time binding. As Krzyzewski notes, time binding is a function unique to humans. In his thesis of time binding, he uses phrases such as the fruits of past labors, accumulated achievements, lives of the past generations, heritor of the bygone ages, and trustee of posterity. These phrases emphasize Krzyzewski's fundamental connection of time binding as a function, or perhaps an expression, of humanity. Such expression finds itself encoded within the symbols of our experience in the forms of pictures, numbers, and words. The symbol-bound information may be found absolutely anywhere, from a reminder scrawled on a sticky note to golden discs inscribed with samples of our time binding to as yet undiscovered time binders elsewhere in our universe. Surely then something as official as the certificate of one's birth must be an important and accurate artifact of time binding indeed. Yet in fact, most elements on a birth certificate are mutable. Adoptive parents are listed rather than biological parents. A child's first and or last name may be changed from the name that was originally registered. Even someone who's no longer a child might make life changes that result in a retroactive change to the birth certificate, such as obtaining a legal change of name. Now, if this all seems a little bit confusing, that's because it is. Our first problem, as you might guess, is that the label birth certificate is ridiculously misleading. Postmen would likely describe a birth certificate as an example of stupid talk. That is, talk that has a confused direction or an inappropriate tone or vocabulary not well suited to its context. It is talk, therefore, that does not and cannot achieve its purposes. As soon as we know anything about types of information that are contained on a birth certificate, we can see that referring to it as a birth certificate is unabashedly stupid. Perhaps in its earliest iteration, the birth certificate was aptly named. Public health initiatives tied to reducing infant mortality and other such concerns rely on having information about birth, live or otherwise. But in America, the importance of the birth registration was emphasized when it became proof of citizenship in World War II, and that was, of course, then needed to make one eligible for employment. In Canada, the certificate is issued by the provincial or territorial governments and is also required identification to apply for other important personal documents, such as a Canadian passport. So the birth certificate has become instead a citizenship certificate. Now, in preparing for this talk, I actually realized that for most of you who are Americans, the notion of the birth certificate as a citizenship certificate is likely not particularly startling. After all, an entire social movement has arisen over the notion that one particular individual's birth certificate is not adequately proving his citizenship, and this appears to raise powerful semantic reactions. Canadian, I have no dog in this hunt. The evaluation of the birth certificate reveals the visceral power that we grant to this document. We believe the birth certificate has some sort of real meaning related to an individual's birth. Now, trans people face similar hurdles when it comes to the birth certificate. Logical fate is the notion that from our assumptions, particular consequences, such as our conclusions, evaluations, attitudes, and behaviors, will follow. Krzyzewski is famous for the aphorism that the map is not the territory, and indeed among folks here at this symposium, I expect I need not enter into deep descriptions as to how such a small piece of paper or some substrate cannot possibly adequately map the territory of the person supposedly described by such a document. But time binding also comes into play. Many people feel the need to protest a trans person's changing of their sex designation on their birth certificate because that designation was not the one assigned at birth, despite other data points on the birth certificate having been accepted to be mutable. Indeed, for trans people, suddenly the notion of the birth certificate as an accurate time-binding artifact is privileged beyond all else. Again, despite this long-standing practice of various data being amended for various reasons. Now, this brings us to an important legal case from the province of Alberta, which is where I'm from, called CF v. Alberta Vital Statistics, decided just earlier this year in 2014. According to the judgment issued by Justice Burroughs, CF is 23 years old. She was born with male genitalia, was given a conventional male name. In childhood, she presented as a male and considered herself female. When she reached adulthood, she took steps to transition. She completed all of the steps which were within her power to accomplish this transition. Now note that last statement, that she completed all of the steps which were within her power to accomplish the transition. In Alberta, and indeed on all birth certificate-related legislation that I've reviewed to date, the individual described on a birth certificate has very little power. The date of the birth is determined by biological processes or surgical extraction. The parentage is determined by biological processes such as the complete expulsion from its birth mother, or legal processes such as adoption. The place of birth is determined by circumstances of the expulsionary birth mother, and so far so good. All of the decisions being made are at least being made by people who may be reasonably expected to have some sort of personal connection with the individual that is so expulsed or extracted. However, one item on the Alberta birth certificate that is actually determined by an agent of the state. That'll be a doctor, nurse, midwife, or some other official registrant. And as you may recall from your own births, or perhaps the birth of someone else you happened to witness, this determination is typically done by an exhaustive, split-second visual examination of the infant's bits and baubles. And as well we all know, medical diagnoses are sufficiently rigorous that we need not ever question the lifelong validity of such a firm, split-second determination. However, CF is not us, and to question the validity of this, she did indeed do. One point that CF submitted to the court noted that the Director of Vital Statistics' refusal to correct the information on her birth certificate, he erred in interpreting the act as authorizing only the correction of information which was in error when it was recorded, rather than information which was in error because it was no longer accurate. Her notion succinctly expresses GS notions of dating, that herself back in circa 1991 would not be the same as herself in circa 2014. The director's letter refusing her request noted that as the registration documents are completed directly after birth, the sex indicator was completed, indicating male based on the evidence at that time, and an error did not occur. The director's assertions are remarkable for a few reasons, not the least of which being that a living being is one who changes over time, something that is fully acknowledged in the practice of amending birth certificates to show changes such as parentage or legal name. And additionally, the director makes reference to some form of evidence used to determine CF's sex, as well as an assertion that an error did not occur in that assessment. Now forgive me, but I must interject a personal observation. I no longer recall my complete expulsion from my birth mother, but having twice been a birth mother myself, I have had a couple of opportunities to observe and expel new time binders into our world. And in both cases, I remember that there was a determination of sex made, and that determination was with a statement to the effect of, it's a... And what I don't recall, and by don't recall I mean I did not hear this because nobody said this, I do not recall at any time a second person saying, yep, you're right, it's a... So error checking, in my experience, was not present during the birth experiences that I had as a birth mother. But given that my sample size is limited to only those two memories, I will allow that perhaps others present here today have experienced that this error checking process implied by the director's letter does indeed exist. Now, the notion that CF might be different today from how she was back in 1991 shows us that there's this completely ignored notion that if all the human determined data that is embedded in a birth certificate, the only one that apparently might not be in error is the individual's certificated sex. Now again, remember that the sole item on that birth certificate that relies on an authority outside the birth or adoptive parents is the authority that's invested by the state in the doctor, nurse, midwife, or other registering authority. And as noted, this certificate is terribly misnamed. Its contemporary function is that of a citizenship certificate. And as such, the citizenship certificate suggests that the state assumes that somehow that only a male or female citizen is a good citizen. So one important point to note that in Canada, trans people do not exist. Now, unlike the Director of Vital Statistics, I can and will point to the evidence for this lack of existence. So Statistics Canada is charged with a number of duties related to information collection regarding the conditions of people in Canada. And in their various reports, we can see that Canada's population is neatly divided as male or female. Now, to be clear, CF was not asking to be classified differently than the categories in which Statistics Canada divides our population. CF was noting that despite being identified as male in her birth registration, which she then was, she's moved on in life, and that the document generated from this registration no longer correctly reflected her life. With the birth certificate functioning as a citizenship certificate, she knew and experienced difficulties obtaining other necessary documents of modern citizenship, including a driver's license or a passport. In analyzing this case, Justice Burroughs noted that the Canadian legal test for discrimination includes focusing on the impact of the impugned law on the human dignity of the person, and having the state wanting individuals only to accept time binding done by a third party upon their entry into the world in a highly prescribed two-value logic does not actually reflect human dignity, and it cannot reflect human dignity. Organizations such as Amnesty International, the American Psychological Association, World Professional Association for Transgender Health, all of those kinds of organizations have actually made statements along the lines that demanding that people submit to surgeries or sterilization before they can amend their documents is a violation of human rights and is appropriate and is urged to be stopped. Now, the notion of social transition is important to underscore, as is the notion of observed sex. There are species on our planet where the appropriate manner of saying hello is to flash one's bits and baubles at each other. However, as far as I can ascertain, this is not a standard of greeting used among human cultures at this time. Although, of course, that may simply be indicative that I am never invited to those sorts of parties. But by insisting that the state must describe an individual under this two-valued logic of male or female as observed at birth, the individual who's now observed socially is undermined by the document purporting to report accurately on that person's sex. So I am pleased to report to you that CF's quest was, satisfied. Despite her youth and lack of professional legal representation, she did this all pro se as a non-lawyer. Her arguments established that the lack of ability to amend her citizenship certificate to reflect accurately her changed circumstances was not merely wrong, but unconstitutional. Notions of time binding expressed in her argument were more than satisfying to the judge, who determined that the Vital Statistics Act in that regard, that of amending her sex as per her changed circumstances, quote, is inconsistent with the provisions of the Constitution of Canada and is, to that extent, of no force and effect. And that, to my mind, is an excellent example of the power of breaking logical fate. Thank you.